So have you wondered, like, God, where are you? Like, you're going through something in your life and you're going through something tough and you just can't see where God is. What on earth, God, are you doing in this circumstance? Or maybe, God, you're not even doing anything in this circumstance. I think we've all experienced those moments in our lives. I know that I have. I remember when I first started ministry, really at this point, it's 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was working at this church in Wisconsin and I was a youth director. And it was a little country church and we worshiped about 200 or so every Sunday with two services. But I was leading the teens, the youth group, and we were killing it. We had like 40, 50 kids there every week consistently, going on summer mission trips, doing volunteer projects. It was really a great time in ministry. I felt like I was doing all these things and I felt like God was just sitting on my shoulder, pushing and encouraging me. But at home, my whole life was falling apart. My relationship with my ex-husband was, or my now ex-husband, my husband then, was so strained. And I couldn't understand how things could be going so good here and things could be going so bad there. Have you ever had a time where you just didn't know where God was? So in chapters 33 and 34, the Lord tells Moses to go ahead and leave Sinai and head towards the land flowing with milk and honey. That's the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, and then now through the Israelites to Moses and the Israelite people. God is telling them it's time for you to leave the mountain and continue on into the wilderness. And what I love in chapter 33, there's this tent of the meeting. This is where Moses is going to have a kind of interface with God, where they're going to have these great conversations. And in chapter 33, verse 11, it talks about how Moses would go and speak to God face to face as with a friend. Now, this gets a little confusing with the next part, so I want to unpack it for us a little bit. So the face-to-face thing, that is kind of a figure of speech. It doesn't actually mean that God and Moses sat down and chat if like you came into my living room like we chatted. It mostly means face-to-face would mean that it was an unfiltered conversation as you would have with a friend. Moses didn't hold anything back. God didn't hold anything back from Moses. It was that kind of open, honest sort of conversation. So when it says face to face, and this is really important because the next part is really fun. You guys are going to love this. Moses then in chapter 33 says to God, "Now, God, I want something from you." And God's like, "Okay." So Moses says, in this very bold way, says, "God, I want you to show me your glory." Moses asks to see God. That's like the boldest statement you could possibly imagine. And then God replies, "Well, you cannot see my face because no one can see my face and then live." But then God does this weird thing. God says, "You know what? I'm going to show you not my glory, but I'm going to show you my goodness." Oh, I love that. I'm going to show you my goodness. And this is how I'm going to do it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put you up on to this cleft of the rock on the hill. And then what I'm going to do is leave you there. And then I'm going to walk by, but I'm going to cover your face, Moses, with my hand. I mean, God's hand. I'm going to cover your face with my hand. And when I walk by, I'll take my hand away. And then, I love this. It's so funny. It says, "Then, Moses, you can see my hind parts." It's like the back of God. Like that is what Moses gets to see, the backside of God. And this is how God shows Moses God's goodness. I also want you to notice that it doesn't say that God's going to show you God's glory, God's justice, God's wrath, or God's power. God can only show the character of God, which is good. So now, why would God show Moses the goodness of God's hind parts? You see, I think that this is it. I think that we can't see right in the moment where God is. It's too much for us. It's too much for us to comprehend. It's too much for us to live into. It's almost just too good, I guess. In the tough thing that you're going through, like right now, God is active and working and passionate about working through it. When I look at that first marriage that I had when things were falling apart, in the moment, I couldn't see where God was. But when I look back and see God's hind parts, when I look back in hindsight, I can see that God was weaving this incredible web the entire way through. I look back and I can see that, there are some things that needed to go for other things to live. My kids were better because of the divorce. I met my husband Ryan, and my 20 years married to him have been way shorter in time than my 4 years married to my first husband. It was even better for my first husband, all going through this. But right there in the moment, I couldn't see it. I couldn't experience it. And I just wondered where God was. And so I think in some ways, we just think that we should be able to know what God's doing right now. But often it's that hindsight or that hind parts looking back at our lives. We can see that God was weaving that whole narrative the whole time. Now, since I'm divorced, I can be more compassionate to folks who are single parenting or co-parenting or going through a divorce themselves or going through marital struggles. It makes it easier for me to relate because I understand and I get part of their story. I wouldn't have that gift had I not gone through that trial. So here's the deal. Whatever it is that you're going through right now, whatever part of your life where you're wondering, like, God, where are you in this? God's goodness is working all the way through it. We just can't see it, honestly, because it's just too much for us. We can't see it, but when we look back on where we have already been, when we look back on the places of our lives, we can then see where God's goodness touched our lives in those moments. And we can leave God promises that God's going to leave God's goodness all over whatever it is that you're going through. One of the best things that happened in my whole life was my divorce. And at that time, there's no way that I could have told you that that was going to be true. But you see, the thing is that God's always working, and God's always faithful, and God's always reconciling all things for our good, even if we can't see it right here. But maybe we can see it in God's hind parts. Here are my questions for you today. When you look back on your life, where do you see God's goodness? And what is it that you're struggling with today as you're listening to this? How maybe could God be using those things that happened in the past to be promises for you for what you're going through right now? Thanks for joining us.